John joined us in 2019, and over the past 4.5 years, almost 5 years now, he's been working with us with the lab since we were one person lab. Now we're five, and yeah, and today John will defend his work. He has published extensively. His thesis is out there. I'm sure most of you have read it. At least the committee have read it and have provided it already.
If you haven't, it's okay. I understand.
If you haven't, it's okay. Yeah. Yeah, right. So the presentation will be 45 minutes, followed by Q&A, followed by deliberation. And I'll pass, the lead of the meeting to Lauren, which is the chair of the thesis. Defense. Meeting. Lauren, would you like to say something?
Yeah, so thank you everyone for being here. So, yeah, again, we'll give John about 45 minutes. At that point, we'll do some little tap for questions and we'll go from there. So whenever you're ready.
Okay. Let me just get situated and all right. So okay. One last sip before we go. All right. Hi, everyone. As everyone said, I'm John. I've been working on this thesis for 4 years-ish now. And today we're just going to be talking about some of the work that I've done around designed affordances and location-based games. And before we get to that, let's just do a little bit of a background on what locative media is, what location-based games are, all that sorts of stuff, just to kind of level set. So first things first, what is locative media, right? It's best described as like the imposition of intangible worlds onto the physical one. So it's like a form of augmented reality, right? Technically, a paper map is in itself locative media, but we're going to be a little more specific in this definition and target the imposition of digital worlds onto physical reality. And okay, there we go. So probably one of the ones that most people have actually encountered is Google Maps, right? So we have a screenshot of Google Maps here. This is of an area in New Paltz, which is somewhere near where I actually live. Few things about this map, first and foremost, you'll notice there's no topographical information, right? For example, this stretch of road right here is a massive hill, but it doesn't matter because this map is intended for driving purposes, right? So topography is not necessarily as big a deal in those cases. But what it does have is a bunch of coffee houses. And if you look at the time that this screenshot was taken, it was around 3 o'clock, which is about, roughly coffee time. So what the map has done here is it's presented me with a version of reality, physical reality, that is relevant to my potential interests, right? And that's a very important thing about locative media, is it's mediating, it's presenting a version of a reality to you, and it's imposing it on top of physical reality, literal reality, right? In this particular case, there's nothing fictional here, right? All these places exist. I've seen them all with my own 2 eyes. I know that there's a wildlife sanctuary there. I know there's a river there. I've gone down these roads. These are all real things. But when we get into location-based games, the imposition onto physical reality isn't an alternate version of reality, right? In this particular case, it is a fictional reality. So for Pokemon Go, for example, you can see that there's still the roads, there's still the various buildings, there's a point of interest in the distance back there. All these things are things that are actually in our physical reality. They're grounding points. They're things that link the game world to our world. But we also have Pokemon, these various creatures that players can interact with, they can capture, they can then use them for other purposes. And then of course we have all the additional non-diegetic interfaces that the user can interact with. And we've got things like points of interest in the background there that are like places that people can go to interact with the things. But at the end of the day, what's happening is the location-based game is imposing a fictional reality onto our own and then contextualizing it into our reality. Now, when we get into these mechanisms, we start to talk about the magic circle, right? these types of games can be considered pervasive games, games that extend beyond something that Johann Huizinga described as a magic circle in Homo Ludens, right? In short, the magic circle recontextualizes the rules of the actions performed within it, right? Sometimes taboos become legal or even desirable, right? In simple terms, punching someone in a boxing ring is sport. In the hallway, it becomes assault. The delineation of this magic circle can be very literal, as is the case in Sumo's dohyo, as I have shown here. However, this isn't always the case, right? As mentioned before, location-based games tend to blur the line more than the other media, right? Players of location-based games must constantly renegotiate their personal boundary lines with the game. In Pokemon Go, for example, the player must ask themselves, what are the acceptable boundaries for catching them? How late can I play? What neighborhoods are good to play in? How comfortable am I with trespassing? Right? These are all questions that someone must ask themselves as they go out to try and catch all the Pokemon. And it's no surprise then that Niantic incorporated warning screens such as this into the game to help better remind these players that there are dangers that exist in the real world, and there must be some care that must be taken while playing the game, right? Now, as I mentioned before, location-based games are my primary probe into the kind of research I do. Centrally, there are three primary areas of investigation in the game, like the overall research that I've identified: health, socialization, and people-place relationships. And naturally, these overlap, as you can see in this Venn diagram here. As location-based games require locomotion to play, it is no surprise that there's a litany of studies relating to the health in location-based games. It's basically ubiquitous. You can throw a dart and hit a study talking about how people walk more while playing a location-based game. But in addition to physical health benefits, there are manifold mental health benefits that have been observed in the current body of research, right? Causal links have been identified between exercise and cognition, as well as mental health beyond the scope of location-based game studies. So if it follows then, if you are able to exercise more, hypothetically, you should encounter better mental health prospects. But even within location-based game studies, the research community has found the genre to alleviate symptoms of individuals with excess work stress, agoraphobia, and even possibly depression in some cases. That being said, the physicality of the game naturally introduces some physiological hazards as well, right? As players navigate physical spaces that are not always the safest for humans. However, on the balance, location-based games tend to be more positive than negative in terms of health prospects, so we'll put it on that side. Socialization may also contribute to these health benefits, as essentially, it's a central component to not only maps, but location-based gameplay itself. The act of a location-based game is inherently social, because players must balance presence, which is the exploring possibilities of their space, and intentionality, which is the motivations of their actions, against the goals of the location-based game itself, and must make decisions about how they're going to interact with it. The whole, don't walk off a cliff while you're playing Pokemon Go thing. In making decisions about these factors, the player makes a social choice to uphold or ignore community mores, norms, and in some cases, as I mentioned, laws. Which brings me to the final category of location-based game research: people-place relationships. Being pervasive games, location-based games have a notoriously weak separation between play and ordinary, right? Local shops are more than a place to get food or clothing, but also a place to play the game, meet friends, and more. The player must decide for themselves how strong that separation is. Moreover, the virtual map alters the player's perceptions of the actual map as well. Digital landmarks exist alongside physical ones, and virtual ownerships can actually convey sensations of physical ownership of spaces. The value of spaces, therefore, can be augmented or reduced by attributes of these digital worlds that we place on top of them. My particular research kind of lies a little bit in the center there, and I'm particularly focused on how interfaces may be modified to have a positive impact on expressions of these various traits and things along those lines. In exploring these three categories, I also stumbled upon the core focus of this thesis, which is location-based game advertising in their affordances and like how that impacts the players. But before we get to that, we should probably talk about affordances. And part of the reason is because it's a little bit of a contentious subject in HCI, with many people offering different definitions. Affordances originally can be traced to James Gibson's ecological approach in 1979 to visual perception, where he described an affordance as a property that may be acted upon by an actor. And that's his direct quote. Importantly, a affordance is not an inherent property of the object, as it requires an actor that can exist to act upon that property. And for this, I'm going to use a cat as an example. So we have some water, and this particular cat is able to drink this liquid water. Therefore, the water affords drinking to the cat, right? However, that same liquid water does not afford support to the cat. If the cat were to attempt to walk on liquid water, they would generally not be pleased with their situation, right? However, we change the physical properties of that water even slightly and freeze it. Suddenly, the cat is able to walk on the water and the water affords support. Now, the important thing here is the thickness of that water determines what type of creatures this affords support to when it's frozen. Because the person that's in that image is not necessarily going to be able to walk on the water that the cat is. But also, a water strider doesn't even need the water to be frozen to walk on it. So what matters is the interplay between the physical property and the actual actor it's acting upon it, right? Now, in 1988, Donald Norman introduced the concept of affordances to the HCI community through the psychology of everyday things, which is the precursor to the design of everyday things. Pretty infamous book in the design community. Now, it wasn't originally Norman's intent, but the definition of affordances saw a shift when we entered HCI. Instead of representing physical concrete properties, affordances in HCI spaces are generally used to refer to digital artifacts, right? Where a true affordance, needs an object and an actor, a designer fabricated affordance, a designed affordance, if you will, only acts upon needs an imagined actor to be produced, right? Very important distinction there. Thus, in HCI, we can consider a designed affordance as the intended affordance of a design, as the intended affordance of an interface, digital or otherwise. For the purposes of this presentation, we refer to interactable elements of design, such as gameplay mechanics or user interfaces, as designed affordances. Now getting into my actual research, right? So this is just the basic theoretical grounding for everything, and there is much, much more we could talk about, because it turns out like pretty much anytime you look into anything in location-based games, you have to unfold the whole like entire background. But I want to just move over to talking about the findings that I've contributed to the state of the art in the completion of my thesis, right? To begin, let's cover like a brief overview, research questions, methods, things along those lines. So when I entered this, I used an iterative model to define my research questions because location-based games are a frequently changing space. They're games as services, so they're almost constantly changing. The Pokemon Go that I started studying against is different from the Pokemon Go that exists today, and next month it will probably be a different experience as well. So as a result, I had to use an iterative model with some kind of like broader research questions to kind of circle the wagons, so to speak. So the first and obvious question for anything along these lines is, who's actually playing these games? What are the players like? What affordances actually gratify those players, right? And then taking it a step further, how do these affordances encourage players to interact with these location-based games, right? And as the players are engaging with these affordances, what do the emerging play patterns look like, right? These first three questions are foundational, right? They try to create a working understanding of how location-based games exert influence on the players. And after we identify this baseline, we can then progress to more complex and nuanced questions. For example, if we alter the mechanics or introduce new methods of interaction, what does that do to the play, right? Is there anything we should do or not do to continue to encourage this type of engagement in play? And then as we tune and adjust these affordances, we must naturally question whether or not this impacts how players interact with places, right? If a feature is disabled on location, will they ignore the place? How much does this presence of an affordance influence player in that physical place, right? These are very important questions because, as I mentioned, notoriously thin boundaries that exist. And then this brings us kind of to the logical conclusion of this work. Are there designs that encourage positive outcomes for players in the games? And are these designs economical for, a location-based game studio to enact, right? Can a location-based game actually be used to improve a community? And what kinds of design affordances are necessary for us to do that? Which brings me to the work that I did in completion of this thesis. So here there are 6 studies that I have laid out. The numbering is the order that they were executed in. The first 2 are exploring mainly the first 4 research questions or so. Specifically, the first one is dealing with player topologies, trying to understand who the players are of various location-based games. The second one was opportunistic research because COVID-19 obviously happened when I started my thesis. So it was a pretty great opportunity to investigate how COVID-19 altered relationships with location-based games. The following 4 were all relating to advertising affordances. Specifically, this one here is dealing with players. This one's dealing with the actual physical locations that are running the advertisements. And this is an iteration of the player design and then some co-designing that we're going to be spending most of our time on today talking. But before we get to that, a few methodological things. For the most part, I leverage semi-structured interviews because semi-structured interviews are great for getting lived experiences of players. And it's easy to have a dynamic interview script because, as we're going, we're trying to understand the experiences of these folks. And naturally, we have to modify our script sometimes because there's things that we simply don't know are going to be there, which we'll get into a little bit of in a second here. Likewise, I use focus groups for the co-designing sessions because it's really essential in human-centric design of any kind because you want to incorporate the people who actually engage with the games and do these things as much as possible. For the quantitative work, just mostly surveys, Likert-based scale stuff, some summary statistics. The most complicated quantitative technique used for this thesis is the max diff analysis, which is using best worst scoring to basically rank various things for folks. Which brings me to the actual findings. So I'm going to divide this into 2 sections. The first dealing with player types and the impacts of COVID, and the second dealing specifically with advertising affordances. As I said before, these were studies to kind of establish a cohesive picture of the location-based games and try to understand a baseline before we started to kind of play with that baseline. So the first finding from the first study is that socialization results in satisfaction, right? And by that, I mean socialization is essential to location-based games. Literally, it's critical. It's a natural part of any location-based game. And as I mentioned before, the act of interacting with a map is in itself an inextricably social action. The games also include these social overlays in terms of affordances, such as rating, gift sending, PvP, and all these other things that are gameplay mechanics within the game that directly include people interfacing with each other and contributing towards a common goal and things along those lines. The interesting thing, though, here is when we examine the traits of these players. So we examine both traits and gratifications. Traits deals with how players orient their play. Gratifications deal with how players feel about their play, right? Players actually tended to organize their play around socialization more frequently, but comparably, their level of gratification was a bit lower, actually, which kind of suggests that there is, in fact, a difference between what people think they want, what people actually want, right? Or rather, there's a difference between what people want and what the thing actually gives them, right? Now, on top of that, we also, because we studied 3 games here, we studied Ingress, Harry Potter Was a Unite, which is now defunct, and Pokemon Go. All these games had statistically different traits and gratifications, right? There were statistical differences between how people expressed affine traits, affine gratifications, things. A player of Ingress cared more about socialization, for example, than a player of Harry Potter Was a Unite. And the question became why, right? And one of the things that we arrived at was that the arrangement of core dynamics, these core game mechanics that are, for example, in a location-based game, explore would be a dynamic. Catch a Pokemon, collect something would be a dynamic. These are like associations of gameplay mechanics that are broad scope, right? It's more of a verb sentence than it is just a specific verb. But if the players, in arranging these atomic mechanics, these atomic dynamics, it resulted in different affine traits and gratifications. Because in Ingress, for example, the elder game is focused on socialization, coming together, working together to create these things called fields, which requires a ton of collaboration, right? So hardcore players of those games, super gratified by socialization, because if you're going to be playing that game for so long, of course you're gratified by socialization, right? In contrast, Harry Potter Was a Unite didn't have as many common rating things. There were some things in the game, but it wasn't as emphasized in the core gameplay, right? And what's important about this is it means that when we assemble located media, such as location-based games, we can really affect user response by the arrangement of the atomic building blocks to generate different responses, which indicates that perhaps using affordances to, affect different responses is in fact possible. And then when we're talking about the COVID-19 pandemic and Pokemon Go, one of the most interesting findings, and the one that was perhaps the most standout because we weren't necessarily expecting this when we were doing the initial study, is that Pokemon Go was being used as a coping mechanism during COVID-19. The gameplay was totally disrupted. Niantic did a ton of changes to the game, and this once again is getting into the whole games as a service thing where you're constantly updating the game, you're constantly changing mechanics, affordances, things along those lines. But Pokemon Go, despite all of that, served as a stability point for folks, right? Because it's still the game that they know. Even if the affordances that are surrounding it have changed, it is still something that they fundamentally care about. It's something that ties them to past times, is something that provides them with opportunities to socialize, experience green spaces, things of that nature, right? And once again, Pokemon Go in this context expresses one of the core attributes of location-based games, right? It offers a tool for the user to recontextualize the world around them to fit their own needs, right? And importantly, it also indicates that when we're dealing with location-based games, we're dealing with something that matters to people, right? It's something that people fundamentally care about. They have extreme passion about these location-based games, and we don't necessarily want to, we want to be careful, we want to tread lightly when we modify these games because it can have an outset impact on folks. Now, let's get to the fun part of the talk where we start to talk about advertising. So I pivoted to this actually because of the COVID-19 pandemic, because there was a thing that happened during COVID-19 where Niantic started to incorporate location-based game advertising, and they always incorporated it, but they opened it up to small and medium businesses, which is the important part here, right? So small and medium businesses suddenly had access to this technology that had been used by McDonald's, Jamba Juice, you name it, it's probably touched it, right? But what we need to remember is in the current market, advertisements are inescapable, for mobile free-to-play games. If it's free to play, you're the product effectively, right? And location-based games are no exception. Now, at the start of my research, there were two primary advertising affordances present in Pokemon Go, which is going to be the primary probe for all the research going forward. In the first, the game presents the user with an object that exists kind of in the skybox of the game, the upper area of the interface. And typically this is rendered as a balloon. When the user taps on that balloon, they then are given this screen. And this screen shows you a bit of advertising copy, indicates that it's sponsored, and kind of like lets you know who is responsible for paying for this thing. Once you click on this open gift tab here, it'll give you a small gift within the game, something like, some sort of resource or another, right? Importantly, when a user clicks on this, there is a 3-second delay before they can click off of it. Very important, very recurring form of advertising. And the second and more ubiquitous of the two adds an in-game location to the map, and in this particular case, it's this Pokestop, which is a point of interest, where it adds this thing to the game, and you'll notice there's a small purple indicator here that indicates it is a sponsored location from the overworld map. When the user taps on the point of interest with their interface, it then opens up this screen, which has a sponsored location information, and they can tap through to look into more details if they so can, if they so choose. So, important thing to note there, there's a lot of choices that the user is allowed to make with this advertising. And we'll get back to that in a second, but just keep that in mind as we go forward. So, sponsored locations were extremely popular. And we'll get into, I have the numbers to show how popular they are. But in the third study of my thesis, I actually talked to owners of small and medium businesses, local businesses that benefited from Niantic's small medium business initiative. It's like business recovery initiative or something. I have it in the thesis. And overall, business owners actually respond quite well to it. It wasn't quite unanimous, but people were very generally satisfied with their experience with the program, right? And what's interesting is very few people could actually point to concrete benefits from the program, as in like not many people had like strong numbers for it. It was more based on their personal feelings, which is why I frame this as satisfaction, right? The notion that users feel like they're getting their whatever, it's worth what they have to put into it, right? Typically, they did express satisfaction with the efficacy of the modality, right? And expressed a vested interest in the program. Many of them actually recommended the program to other folks, like as soon as they got into it or well into while they had it. But also, a lot of these folks were players of the game themselves, because the advertising or the advertising was initially exposed to people who were actually game players, right? For such participants, the digital affordance introduced by advertising recontextualized the spaces that they were in, right? Because keep in mind, these are people's businesses, right? And now we're adding another layer onto this, where now it's an area for play as well, because a lot of these people are also players of the game. So it creates these interesting dynamics in the spaces. Where it gets interesting, though, is that for location-based game advertising, the success is actually, more than anything, tied to the local community, right? If a business had evidence of success, it was because they had an extremely active community and they interacted with that community. So businesses ran events, in-store promotions, and there was even one business that actually included Pokemon Go as a service, where they had a store account. And that store account would then be used to interact with various people, and like, oh, you want this Pokemon? I'll trade with you. And the store, offered this additional service. So it's like adding to what this store can offer, right? That was in particular, that was a friendly local game store. So specifically focused around gameplay and things along those lines, but it made perfect sense in that context, right? Returning to the 3 areas of location-based game study I mentioned before, location-based game advertising may act as an apparent enabler of not only socialization, but redefine people-place relationships. And this isn't actually a picture that I took from like 2016, I want to say, when Pokemon Go first started. This is in the Colony Center, and this is just like some, library that the mall put up to kind of attract people to play the game and use the space and kind of take advantage, once again, of modifying people-place relationships, right? Basically what this means is if we can apply this properly and leverage it and combine it, we can use location-based games to draw people to places and things, and it can be very powerful and very impactful on people's lives, right? Now, returning to the advertising before, I think it's really important that we just take a second to talk about this again, because if we strip down the constituent parts of these advertisements, right, particularly the sponsored supply balloon. In the case of the sponsored supply balloon, the balloon hovers over the stuff we actually care about, right? It presents us with something we might not necessarily want, and we have to exit that thing. What that is to me is kind of a pop-up advertisement, right, at its core. Because, like, mechanistically, if we just really tear it down to its core parts, it is a pop-up. It is something that a user has to deal with or ignore or what have you. But people loved supply balloons, right? And my studies explored why a pop-up is palatable in this context. And it comes down to 2 factors: agency and aesthetics. Now, getting into the notion of agency, right? And we're going to just do a little bit of a whirlwind background because there's a lot to talk about agency, but this is just kind of like the broad strokes and some like a easy visualization to kind of get you in the right headspace. In the most simple terms, player or user agency is a measure of how well a user is able to convert intent into action. So let's use this recording of a game as an example. I put an on-screen button to signify a jump action, right? In this particular case, when the user presses the button right there, the character jumps. When they release, it falls. This is an example of good agency, right? And this is in a different context, albeit in a platformer, but user intent can be directly transferred to action within the game world. In the case of bad agency, user intent takes a second. There's a delay, right? It's not always guaranteed to be exactly as they want it to. In the case in really bad agency, the interface is basically not an interface, and it's more of a suggestion. As you can see here, the user would be trying to jump, and like nothing happens, and all of a sudden it happens. Of the 3, obviously, good agency is the most preferred. If you have bad agency, at least you can user can play around it. If you have ugly agency, not as great. And I don't think anyone would necessarily accept an interface like this. But when we return to user agency and advertising and location-based games, the player of the game wants to perform actions in the game, right? Catch Pokemon, battle trainers, gather resources, and whatever that particular location-based game allows them to do. The supply balloon, notably, does not impede these actions. It appears in the upper quadrant of the screen, above the Pokemon, above the relevant things that they can interact with, right? And that's really important because it reduces the risk of accidental interaction. An accidental interaction is an affront to agency, ultimately. Sponsored locations similarly preserve agency, right? By presenting the user with a location on the map and then highlighting that location is in fact sponsored by having a little tiny purple dot that you can see. So a user can choose to select that option. And once again, choice is key here. Choice is agency. Now, pop-ups, however, And banner advertisements, such as this mock-up, are just pure affronts to agency, right? The user has no choice in consuming this content. It's just there, right? And they have no obvious means for dispelling it, right? It directly harms the user's ability to interact with the game, and it may even result in discontinuation of play because, oh, now there's like a quarter of my screen taken up by something I don't care about. Now, getting into that and focusing in a little bit more. The second factor is aesthetics, right? With so many components of located media research, aesthetics is a field unto itself, and one that has a lot of discourse about what aesthetics are.
Is he peeing?
Oh no, that's just a.
I'm sorry, I think it's.
I see it. I see it.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I see it. It's the hopper's feather, the leaf.
Okay, when you said aesthetics, I thought it was my brain was something else. Sorry.
Well, that's a great.
Yeah, that's an example of bad aesthetics. Okay.
Well, that you know right there. Okay. Aesthetics have a lot of meanings.
Pardon.
But to
Now you can't undo it.
no, I can't. Thank you. So we're gonna work with a very simplified definition for aesthetics, right? Good aesthetics are visually pleasing portions of an interface, right? So if you look at it and it doesn't make you want to tear your eyes out because it's garish and ugly and what have you. In this particular example, it's extremely poor aesthetics, right? The existing font library doesn't match the application. The box for the advertisement doesn't have any visual analogs within the interface. And it takes up, as I said, a weird portion of the screen, right? However, even if we resolve these aesthetic problems, it still wouldn't be aesthetically cohesive with the interaction aesthetics of the application. Now, interaction aesthetics is a term described by Xenakis and Arnelos to describe the phenomena of interfaces presenting visually coherent information to signify the presence of digital affordances. And I say signify very specifically because it's the correct term for affordances. On the Pokemon Go main screen, for example, we have a set of buttons at the bottom here. Now, if you look at all these buttons, they're for the most part rounded, right? They're in some cases are transparent. There's a little light transparency and a slight drop shadow that's visible that indicate that this is apart from the map itself. This is a thing that we can interact with. And not only that, when we interact with these things, they open up an additional window or dialogue, right? In contrast, we have a compass rose up here. While we can interact with that, it has a different behavior. It snaps the camera to match whatever direction we are physically pointing, right? In having those variations in the design language, it can convey different things and can convey, okay, this is what this button does without even telling you. This is what this button does without even telling you, right? And that's very important for interaction aesthetics because like once we get back to the banner advertisement, corners are sharp, there's transparency, it's visually distinct from the map, but not intentionally, right? As a result, the final product is discordant visually, and it leaves the user a bit confused regarding how they actually are supposed to interact with that design element, right? Now, to make matters worse for games, we have to worry about something called aesthetic storytelling, right? Now, how many folks are familiar with the Pikmin game, vaguely? Okay. So, long story short, Pikmin is a Nintendo GameCube game where you play as a character who controls a swarm of these small little plant creatures called Pikmin. They're like supposed to be like that big or something like that. The game is set on an Earth-like planet where your character is very small, interacting with flowers as if they're trees, and fighting monsters such as the dreaded Bulborb, and gathering resources like Duracell batteries. So, in actuality, the player is an alien visiting Earth, which is debatable, depending on which version of the game you're playing, and gathering resources with their tiny companions, right? This game has established a narrative. We're seeing that Duracell battery, however, is not only immersive, but kind of delightful in some cases, where it's like, oh, that's weird. That's kind of fun. I have this in my backyard. I have this in my drawer, or it's literally in the controller that I'm playing this game with right now. So when we get into location-based games, the central design and story is conveyed by the experience is the imposition of the physical world upon reality, right? So we have, for here, example here, a Starbucks. This is a sponsored location, right? It is in a physical location that there is in fact a Starbucks that is present. In this particular case, we're contributing to selling that fusion between reality and fiction, right? Even if it's an advertisement, it does reflect the physical location of the business, and it provides additional contextualization, right? This is all contributing to that pervasive nature of location-based games. It's not detracting from it. If anything, it's enhancing it because there's already an existing design language that exists in the location-based game, and we're taking advantage of that. But the narrative of the underlying game also matters, right? For example, in Pikmin Bloom, which is a location-based game version of Pikmin, you can find these special decor Pikmin who have items from the real world as cosmetics. In this particular case, I have a little blue Pikmin here who has a Mario hat. And of course, Mario is from, the Mushroom Kingdom, but realistically, he's from our world. And this is in fact advertising, right? Even though Nintendo owns both properties, it is marketing within another property that they own for another property that they own, right? But once again, it's delightful. It's not something that takes away from the game. If anything, it adds to the game because now you have this character who has something that you use or care about in real life, and it's associated with you. It's an acceptable design, right? Now, moving forward with my research, I specifically started to talk to users, right? And a lot of this, the reason I'm talking about all this is because of interactions with users, where aesthetics and agency were always very clearly the thing that they cared about most. In fact, people use the word intrusive, obtrusive to describe advertising that's not good. And they also describe themselves as being immunized to advertising, which is a very strong word. But what I did was I generated some experimental designs after interacting with some folks in a focus group, right? And for this thesis work, I ran 4 focus groups with a total of 13 participants. And I asked participants to suggest some potential designs for location-based game advertising. And using the output of these focus groups, these 8 designs came about. In this one, we have an example of a person who's, like representing like a barista or something. We have billboards and game things. There's an item that is branded. We have temporary locations. We have a version of banner ads that is a literal banner in the game world. On screen, like on map billboards, some receipt action, and a piece of in-game clothing based on the language of the game, right? And these designs were then mocked up, as I show you here, and then used for a best-worst scaling thing, in addition to 8 other designs. And then for these designs, many of these were existing. So our shirt, and then these 2 over here are the 2 that we showed already. And the rest are just based on various examples that I got from various users during the interviews. And I should also note, I used a brand name advertising at the time for Exco. This study was conducted before Elon Musk changed the name of Twitter. So, yeah, so it's a little less bland name now than it was before. Although I did generate some brand name examples. I didn't use them for obvious reasons because I didn't want to bias user responses based on their pre-existing exposure to various brands. But Wendy was literally the idea that someone pitched to me, so I felt like I needed to make it. Then we've got Barista Pidgey and of course Canto Fried Chicken. So returning to the findings report, in total, the survey that actually was the best worst scaling reached 304 members of the location-based game community, and they overwhelmingly preferred designs that emulated pre-existing mechanics, right? Sponsored locations and balloons were naturally right up there on that list. And they also like things that gave them more gameplay opportunities or were minimally visually intrusive, right? The first two options, temporary sponsored locations and sponsored locations, provide players with new opportunities to play, right? New locations to play in the game. It's agentful design, right? It's providing them with the option of choice. Then the third is advertising balloons. Once again, choice, something that exists within the confines of the game. They feel comfortable with it. And then there's also in-game offers, which really not terribly different visually from a sponsored location, right? It's just a variation on top of the sponsored location. And now keep in mind, this is in direct agreement with the original hypotheses that we had when we were working on this particular study. Now, regarding the least acceptable designs, notably, they all have a trend in that each of these designs presents the user with an advertising that they can't choose to direct. This adds it to a raid battle, which is a gameplay mechanic. These two put something like the advertising onto the overworld, and they can't, hide it or dispel it. Now, I deliberately left the 16th worst off because I just want you to take a guess as to what that one was, because it was banner advertising. People hate banner ads. They absolutely hate them. And when I say they hate them, I mean they hate them. Banner advertising, if we take the standardized best worst score, scored 3 times as poorly as the nearest other option. It was almost universally reviled. Now, there's two things at play here. First, banner advertisements are just hated by users of location-based games and users in the general sense. It's just, people don't like banner ads. Second, and this is the more important explanation for future work, is that contextualizing the aesthetics of the application, the advertisement, contextualizing it to the gameplay's aesthetics actually has an impact, right? And there's a really good example of this in this data. So we had 2 examples that were very similar, right? This is Xcode in the Latin alphabet, and this is Xcode in the unknown, which is like an in-game, in-universe alphabet for the Pokemon franchise. So when we compared those, the aesthetically grounded one outperformed by a considerable amount the non-aesthetically grounded, which kind of helps reinforce the notion that good aesthetics can really help ground a advertising and make it palatable and acceptable. Because keep in mind, remember, pop-up ads are kind of acceptable in location-based games, right? And it's because of the combination of agency and aesthetics.
Could you explain the metric just real quick?
Oh, yeah. Basically, this is an average of scores. So somebody ranks one thing as best, another thing as worst. And the number of times that someone ranks something best.
Binary decisions.
But yeah, it's a binary decision where they're presenting 5 options. And it reduces the reason you do that over a ranking structure is because it's more stable. As opposed to ranking, which people have a lot of issues with actually physically ranking things. So we use best worst.
So you hand them a lot of binary decisions.
Yes.
And this is how off of the average of how often it's chosen as the worst or the best of those 2 options.
Positive is best, negative is
Right,
worst.
so those middle, they're about a 50-50 chance of
Pretty
being.
much.
Gotcha. Okay.
Which is why this being so close to negative
It's
6
almost
is such.
always.
Yeah, it's literally almost always selected as negative. Although there are some exceptions, but that's a very complicated section that we're not going to get into in this presentation because we're already over. Now, before I open things up for questions, I just kind of want to review the core contributions of this work. First, agency affirming features are immensely important to the acceptance of designed affordances within the context of location-based games. We talked specifically about advertising today, but I suspect that this applies to other contexts because of the pre-existing work that we've done with COVID-19 research as well as what the current literature says. If we contextualize it through this affordance lens, it actually seems to indicate that this is a recurring trend. As such, whenever we're designing affordances for these types of experiences, it's imperative that the designer consider the consequences of the design on player agency. Furthermore, even unfavorable designs can be made more palatable through the judicious use of aesthetic coherency and agency affirming design, right? Once again, returning to the sponsored location, the sponsor's supply balloon, it's not universally adored, but it is a pop-up that people don't immediately reject. It's a pretty big deal if we're talking about it in terms of like just sheer user reaction. Regarding the future of my work, I have a number of research options available to me. There are other games such as Orna RPG, Monster Hunter Now, which don't use point of interest based gameplay mechanics as much. Peridot is an entirely AR based game, which results in different types of affordances that would be employed for types of that type of research. Likewise, Niantic has recently been rolling out AR advertising. This is an example of them using Lunchables to basically build a Lunchables thing in your world. It's less impressive than it sounds when I say that, but it is kind of cool. And then, of course, the thing that I really care about is the non-commercial applications of this. So this is the Elting library from New Paltz. And I think that there's a really interesting design space that exists here where we can use location-based games to help guide communities towards understanding of their local community better and better understanding of environments and things along those lines. But obviously today, location-based games are kind of centralized in companies like Niantic, where it's kind of expensive to deploy them, and obviously it takes a lot of resources. But there's avenues to explore with that kind of thing. This is just a brief list of the publications that I've participated in. There's a few Kai publications there. There's Tokai there, and some game stuff, and all of this is available in the dissertation as a whole, which I can make available to anyone who wants. But that's everything. And I guess it's I'm a little over, but time for questions.
I have a whole bunch, but there were some are short and some are long, and I was sitting there texting myself.
Okay.
I want to give others a chance. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Okay.
Was there a working definition of agency that you were working off of, or was it just choice as agency?
In the conversion of intent into action is the.
Did you make up that definition, or did you get it from someone?
I believe there is a citation for that. I don't remember off the top of my head who it's from, but I did pull that citation. That was something that was initially pulled from a synthesis.
I mean, just if you do agency work in the future, there are validated survey instruments that test for agency that work off of definitions. And, I think your work as it is, it seems self-contained. But just in the future, if you do more agency based work, it might be interesting to look at some of the varying definitions. So there's many different definitions of agency, and there are validated instruments for some of those definitions.
Gotcha. Okay.
So I wanted to talk a little bit about the affordance part too. So obviously actor and the object that you have, but also, when you're looking at a lot of this stuff in the design space, how obvious is the intent of what it is that you're trying to do. Things are, the balloon, for example, is a nice way of having a very simple understanding of what you need to do. But people make money off of clicking that balloon.
Mhm.
If I know I can avoid that balloon, what happens to, you know, there's sort of a
Yeah.
challenge there with advertisers.
Yeah, so that is actually a tension that is very, very notable, because ultimately at the end of the day, you're fighting between advertisers who want their things to be seen and the player who really doesn't want to see anything other than what they're trying to play. The mechanism around that typically location-based games take is something called the value exchange model, right? It's a very specific thing and something that people actually. There's a study by Google that like points to people actually would be upset if games removed the value exchange model. Like it's like something like 50% of players expressed actual like they would react negatively if someone took out value exchange, which is interesting. But you have to kind of like balance that, because if you overtune that, it's super dangerous to overtune that for a lot of reasons, right? One, if you overtune it, people get enough, then they don't need to do it anymore. Two, if you overtune it and it's a competitive game, such as Ingress, suddenly, oh, the economy is flooded with these items. Now the entire gameplay like loop is screwed up completely and we can't do anything, right? So it's a very delicate balance ultimately, but it is a very important balance, right? And part of the reason why I advocate for this like agentful design coupled with aesthetically pleasing design is because we need to deal with the value exchange problem, right? And if you have a more agentful design that's more aesthetically pleasing, you can actually get away with a little more, because ultimately what you're trading in people's attention, right? And that's like the value you're actually trading, right? And if you can make it so paying attention to the thing isn't negative, you can make it so people care more about the thing and like they're more willing to like interact with it. So like, for example, going back to the core, one of the core intents behind using like AR technology,
Yeah.
right, is you make it a playful game that now it's like, oh, I can do a fun thing with this. So now I actually have a reason for doing it other than just the resource. And then you can actually reduce the amount that you have to pay into, you know, the value of exchange. So, but it's difficult and complicated and it requires a lot of iteration.
Second question that I had, another part, and you may not have covered this in your dissertation, which is fine, just tell me you did.
Mhm.
But looking at how much the attention of the player is pulled away, we know that the 2D user interface part can have an effect of pulling user out of the game experience.
Mhm.
Did you look at any of these techniques to see how much it pulled the player out of the experience they were having?
We didn't reach that part of the research. We were more focused on the actual like emotional response to it, right? Because the one of the things that I didn't mention in this presentation is we were focusing more towards like the relationship with place. So for example, in the case of like effective advertising design, the first of the two semi-structured interviews that I did talking to players of advertising, we focused particularly on memorability, right? And how like memorability of spaces mattered. So we were more focused on the hybridization with reality than we were focused on the physical 2D interface, just because that was the direction we were focusing.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, thank you.
But yeah. Ben?
So again, this might be something that you touched on as you went through everything. But with the fact that a lot of these games are like service model games, you initially started out looking at Pokemon Go and why are people playing this breakdown.
Mhm.
As the game evolved and changed, did you revisit that to see are people playing this for different reasons as it progresses? Because what it launched as and what it is now are fairly different.
They are fairly different. I mean, I always incorporated a little bit of that in the discussions with folks. But I would say that there's probably a space for another study, just reassessing, right? I think the broad strokes will remain similar. just because like the discussions that I've had with folks, they're like ways that they talk about playing the game, the way they talk about interacting with folks is very similar. But I think that there's space for that, and also on top of that, there's more location-based games that exist, different ones. I'm actually super interested in how Monster Hunter Now changes the equation, because that is a much more, so Pokemon Go is more like throwing Pokeballs, right? And it's like a mini game. Whereas Monster Hunter Now is like you do full-on battles with monsters. So it's like a very different, you have different gameplay mechanics at play, which likely impacts, topologies, gratifications, all these types of things. But I think that there's space for more investigation in that. I think it's honestly something that, because it's games as service, I think periodic like refreshers is a good idea. But I was mindful of like various changes. The difficulty though with researching Pokemon Go, with using Pokemon Go as a probe for research, I should say. The difficulty with using Pokemon Go as a probe for research is anytime Niantic changes something, that is the thing everyone wants to talk about in the interview. And that happened a number of times. And like, I think I ran one after they changed how remote reading worked, and that was a nightmare. There was a lot of fun experiences when it came to Pokemon Go, we'll just say. So, but yeah, no, the fact of the matter is, I don't think that there's going to be like very strong changes, especially because it's not like they added rating, right? Because if you compare the original Pokemon Go with the present Pokemon Go, there are just so many multiplayer affordances that exist now that didn't originally exist. Because like multiplayer in Pokemon Go before was not really multiplayer, right? You just kind of walked around together, visited things, and then put Pokemon in a gym or battled the gym. But like really speaking, you weren't really playing together, you're just playing in the same space. But now, because rating is a thing, and these types of PvP affordances exist now that didn't previously exist, that caused more of a shift, I think, than like the incremental changes. But I think there is space to examine how the incremental changes have altered, play. So.
I got my 8. Well, actually, now it's 9 questions. We don't have to do them all now. It's just I pick off some of the easy ones.
Yeah.
Chow, me and David Long were part of the, oh my God, we need to research blockchain and NFTs.
Mm-hmm.
Did that come up during like, lockdown where, did they try to move in that direction with these various games?
I can't say due to NDAs.
Okay, yeah, because I imagine there's I was at GDC and an utter fixation. It's not the point of your research, but
yeah,
it's more of a warning. Things that go away sometimes return.
Yeah.
And
no, I know.
If you go down this field, I'll make a bet it comes back to the people. Revenge of the blockchain.
Yeah, I can't speak specifically to that because that was discussions that I had with Niantic, but yes.
Yeah, I got I wrote a note about accidental action.
Uh-huh.
Oh, I remember what that was. I think if I understood the talk right, accidental action somehow bad or something.
Yeah.
Like, did you mean like jumping off a cliff or just bad design?
Basically, so one of the things that happens, particularly in like mobile games, is when you're tapping and you accidentally mistap on something, right? So going back to this example, 1 second, I'm just gonna. There we go. So going back to this example here, an example of an unintentional action, right, would be you're trying to click on this location and you accidentally click on.
Oh, okay. Yeah, my brain would say something like there, like from a long time ago, the gravity gun. Sometimes accidental design, it leading to emerging gameplay.
Yeah,
which is I don't think the point of this research, but there's like a whole other thread where you could like emerging gameplay.
So that is a part of this research, particularly in the COVID-19 portion.
Oh, okay.
Because when we're talking about COVID-19, the like emerging gameplay, quote unquote, is that people were using this as like a psychological approach, right? Where it's not necessarily gameplay, but people were changing the use of the game to fit their particular use case, right?
That makes me happy because It's not that you need to use a magic term, but it's like emerging gameplay is like a sort of.
Yeah.
Holy grail of this.
Yeah.
I wrote a note about billboards. You saw me tapping the phone, this is what I was doing.
Yeah.
Subject of another, like some other day would be, when you're driving and you see the billboards, that is a non-interactive.
Mhm.
I was thinking,
Well, billboards are location-based
yeah,
advertising
it's interesting.
specifically. So there's location-based advertising, right, which is an existing term. And then location-based game advertising, which is now this term, because we're talking about specifically the interactive, potentially interactive.
And then I have a deeper question, which this may be your career, we can hold off. I'm gonna talk about what's between location-based life and location-based games. There's an in-between I wanted to ask you about, but I can do that later during the other session. So in other words, is there such a term as location-based interactive experience?
Well, yeah, that's location-based media, that's located media.
And then, at what point does does geogame and locative media and location-based game, okay, geogame, location-based game, locative media is the bigger thing.
So yeah, located media is the superset,
Okay,
right? Right, and then within located media, you have like a billboard. Right, or a sign. Right? Or you have location-based games. Right, and within that, there might be overlap between these things and all sorts of stuff like that.
a geogame would be something, okay, a subset, is
Yeah,
it?
or GeoGames at their core are location-based games. The terms are synonymous.
What gets messed up, Chris left, is another Chris thing, shout out. He and I were on the entertainment advisory board for RIT.
Mhm.
The film industry, about 2018 and 2019, decided a location-based game is you go to a movie theater and put on VR goggles and play something from a movie.
I mean,
We
technically, because you are dealing with a specific location, but like, arguably, I'd argue that that's not a valid use of the term, but that's just mainly my personal thought is that the specific location should have more meaning than like, if I could do the thing at home.
I know, I just wanted to throw that out
Yeah.
there, it was a weird thing I stumbled.
That is a weird classifier.
And all the Disney, all these movie producers, they just rested the term.
Well, Disney grasps at terms constantly,
I know.
so that's like their whole thing.
I have a few more, but I can defer.
Does anyone else have any,
Thanks.
Yeah.
So I was just wondering, like, a very broader question. So what are the cultural implications of your findings? I think, because, location-based games are like pretty international,
Yeah.
so it's very international. Did you find any, those kind of aspects in your research, especially in the first couple of chapters?
Yeah, so unfortunately, a lot of my subjects came from the North American continent, right? So the amount of like cross-cultural investigation that I was able to do was limited. There were a few interesting things in COVID-19 when I was studying COVID-19, but that was more focused on the differences in how COVID lockdowns applied, right? And how different cultures reacted to COVID. So that I structured more along the lines of how restrictive the lockdowns were versus how unrestricted, right? Because if my memory is correct, obviously places that had less restrictions tended to be more consistent when it came to like gameplay and things along those lines, which would be partially cultural, partially like mechanistic of like, changes to things. But part of the problem is a lot of the research I did, because especially the later research was specifically dealing with location-based game advertising. So I had to go in areas that location-based advertising was happening, and that was mostly North America. Regarding the COVID-19 stuff, that wasn't the focus of that research, but as I said, there was some interesting stuff there. And in terms of the initial research, the topology research, I don't think that there was any strong findings indicating anything any like strong like cultural biases or variations. I think that there's a lot of interesting stuff that can happen there, particularly because I know that culturally, Pokemon Go is played very differently in Japan than it is played in the US. You know, and also one of the interesting things is even within the United States, there are different cultures around how Pokemon Go is played. So, and I haven't really isolated what that like variation is, but there's this notion of gyms in Pokemon Go, right? Where you place a territorial claim on a piece of land in the game, right? So there's a point of interest, and in that point of interest, you can put all sorts of like your Pokemon, and that Pokemon then defends that point of interest, and you have claim ownership of that. But what's interesting is depending on where you are, there's like this unspoken rule, this cultural norm that exists, where players will not like if someone hasn't been in the gym for long enough, they won't kick someone out, right? Because as you stay in the gym longer, you get coins, which are a premium resource in the game, and in exchange, you know, once you get kicked out, you get those resources. But if you get kicked out too early, you don't get the full amount, right? But there's this interesting cultural thing where like people will actually get mad if someone like breaks that norm, that breaks that like unspoken rule. But like I think that there's more that can be explored there, because like you know, I suspect that like group thinking and like communal action, things along those lines, have an impact on like how receptive that is, and that might be a regional thing. But obviously I didn't really explore down that pathway. But I think that there's definitely research to be explored in that space, because obviously, like once again, located media is very positionally based, right? And because it's so positionally based, any of the cultural implications of positionality also take effect. And I mean, at its core, it's a map, and maps are inherently cultural, inherently political entities, right? Which is this whole, there's so much space to explore within the confines of location-based games, because at the end of the day, we're talking about a game that takes place on a map, and then you have all the trappings of what a map is, and all the trappings of like physical interaction and social interaction, coupled with these gameplay mechanics that are designed, right? The designed affordances that I specifically talked about. So
I have more, but do we call it here and then
yeah, I think that's
let's save it for the
Yeah.
okay.
okay.
All right.
Okay, thank you all.
Thank you.
Yeah, we'll excuse everyone else and to fix the committee, and thank you.
Thank you.
Do you want to take a
Take a
break?
moment,
Do we-
I'll
we like that before we?
I'll take a bathroom break and refill my water.
John,
Huh?
you have to wait outside.
Okay.
Everybody has to go outside. Yeah.